Before we begin, a word. Every voice you are about to hear could belong to a real person, and the next one could be yours. Claim a part and read it aloud at footnotesandfolly.click. Welcome back. I am Pemberton, and this is Book 15 Part 3. We come now to the tragedy at the very center of Herod's life. He loved his wife Mariamne, the Hasmonean princess, with a violent and jealous love, and he was surrounded by a court that knew exactly how to turn that love into a weapon. His sister Salome and his mother hated Mariamne, and Mariamne, proud and deeply wounded, could not hide her contempt for the man who had murdered her brother and her grandfather. Out of that poison come the accusation, the trial, and the execution of the queen, and then a remorse that nearly destroys Herod's mind, a grief so wild that he calls her name through the empty palace and falls into a sickness that almost kills him. Her mother Alexandra, trying to seize the moment, is put to death in her turn, and so is Costobarus, Salome's husband, together with the sons of Barbers, the last men who might have carried the Hasmonean cause. And then, as if the house's misery were not enough, 10 citizens conspire to cut Herod down in his own new theatre, offended by the foreign games and trophies he has planted in Jerusalem. Let us go on, and it is a hard road tonight.
When Herod returned to his kingdom, he found his household in complete disorder. His wife Mariamne and her mother Alexandra were deeply troubled, because they believed, as was natural, that they had not been placed in the fortress of Alexandrium for their safety, but were being kept there like prisoners under guard. They had no authority over anything, whether in other people's affairs or even in their own. Mariamne also thought that the king's love for her was not sincere, but only a useful pretense that served his own interests. She considered it deceitful. What grieved her most was that he had allowed her no hope of outliving him if any harm should come to him. She remembered the orders he had previously given Joseph, and for that reason she tried to win over her guards, especially Sohemus, because she understood that everything depended on him. Sohemus remained loyal to Herod, and neglected none of the duties entrusted to him. But the women gradually won his favor by kind words and generous gifts. Little by little he was overcome, and at last he revealed all the king's instructions to them. His chief reason was that he no longer expected Herod to return with the same authority he had held before. He thought he would be safe from any danger on Herod's account, and that by this disclosure he would greatly please the women who were not likely to be ignored when the government was settled. Indeed, he supposed they would be able to reward him richly, since they would either rule themselves or stand very close to whoever did rule. He also had another reason for hope. Even if Herod succeeded in everything he wished in return, Sohemus believed he could not oppose his wife's desires, because he knew the king's affection for her was beyond measure. These were the motives that led Sohemus to reveal the orders he had received. When Mariamne learned that there was no end to the dangers she faced from Herod, she was greatly offended and deeply disturbed. She wished that he might receive no favor from Caesar, and she came to regard life with him as almost unbearable. Later she said this openly, without hiding her resentment. Herod now sailed home in great joy because of the unexpected success he had achieved. As was proper, he went first to his wife. Because he loved her so much, and because of the intimacy between them, he preferred her above everyone else and told the good news to her alone. He greeted her warmly. But while he was telling her of his success, she was so far from rejoicing that she was plainly sorry. She could not hide her resentment. Relying on her dignity and noble birth, she answered his greeting with a groan, and made it clear that she grieved over his success rather than rejoiced in it. Herod was disturbed, because she was showing him not merely signs of suspicion, but unmistakable signs of dissatisfaction. It troubled him greatly to see that his wife's astonishing hatred for him was no longer concealed but open. He took it badly, yet because of his love for her he could not bear the situation steadily or settle on one course of mind. At one time he was angry with her, and at another he reconciled himself to her. Since his feelings kept shifting from one passion to another, he remained in great uncertainty. He was caught between hatred and love. He often felt ready to punish her for her insolence toward him, but because he loved her deeply in his soul, he could not free himself from her. In short, he wished to have her punished, yet he feared that if he put her to death, he would unknowingly bring an even heavier punishment upon himself. When Herod's sister and mother saw this state of mind toward Mariamne, they thought they had found an excellent chance to act on their hatred of her. They provoked Herod's anger by telling him long stories and slanders about her, the kind that could stir up both hatred and jealousy. Although he was willing enough to listen to them, he did not have the courage to act against her as though he believed their accusations. Still, his feelings toward her grew worse and worse, and the evil passions on both sides became more inflamed. She did not hide her attitude toward him, and he turned his love for her into anger against her. But just as he was about to carry the matter beyond all remedy, he received the news that Caesar had won the war, that Antony and Cleopatra were both dead, and that Caesar had conquered Egypt. Herod therefore hurried away to meet Caesar, and left his household affairs in their existing condition. As he was setting out, Mariamne recommended Sohemus to him. She said she owed him thanks for the care he had taken of her, and she asked the king to give him a place in the government. Accordingly, Herod granted him an honorable office. When Herod came into Egypt, he was admitted to Caesar with great freedom, as a man who was already his friend, and he received very great favors from him. Caesar gave him the 400 Galatians who had served as Cleopatra's guards, and he restored to him the territory that had been taken from him through Cleopatra's influence. Caesar also added Gadara, Hippos, and Samaria to his kingdom, and besides these the coastal cities of Gaza, Anthedon, Joppa, and Stratos Tower. With these new acquisitions Herod became more magnificent, and he escorted Caesar as far as Antioch. But when he returned, the increase of his prosperity through these foreign additions was matched by a still greater increase of troubles in his own household, especially in the matter of his wife. This was the very point in which he had formerly seemed most fortunate. His affection for Mariamne was in no way less than the affections celebrated in history, and with good reason. As for Mariamne, in other respects she was a chaste woman and faithful to him. Yet she had something of a naturally harsh temper, and she treated her husband rather imperiously because she saw that his love made him almost a slave to her. She did not properly consider that she lived under a monarchy and was in another person's power. Accordingly, she behaved toward him with bold disrespect, though he usually turned it aside as a joke and bore it with moderation and good temper. She also openly reproached his mother and sister because of the lowliness of their birth, and she spoke unkindly of them. Thus there had already been disagreement and unforgiving hatred among the women, and it now grew into sharper mutual insults than before. These suspicions increased and lasted for a whole year after Herod returned from Caesar. The misfortunes that had for a long time been kept within some bounds of decency finally broke out all at once, when an occasion arose. One day around noon, the king had lain down on his bed to rest, and because of the great affection he had always had for Mariamne, he called for her. She came in, but she would not lie down beside him. When he greatly desired her company, she showed contempt for him and added, as a reproach, that he had caused her father and her brother to be killed. Herod took this insult very badly, and in sudden anger was ready to use violence against her. The king's sister Salome saw that he was more disturbed than usual, and sent in the king's cupbearer, whom she had long before prepared for such a scheme. She ordered him to tell the king that Mariamne had persuaded him to help prepare a love potion for Herod. The king seemed greatly concerned and asked what this love potion was. He was to say that Mariamne had the potion, and that he had only been asked to give it to the king. But if Herod did not seem much disturbed about the potion, the cupbearer was to drop the matter, and if he did so, no harm would come to him. After giving him these instructions, Salome sent him in at that moment to make the accusation. The cupbearer entered in a composed manner, so that what he said might seem credible, yet with some appearance of haste. He said that Mariamne had given him presents, and had persuaded him to give the king a love potion. When this moved Herod, the cupbearer added that the love potion was a mixture she had given him, but that he did not know its effects. For that reason, he had decided to report it, as the safest course both for himself and for the king. Herod had already been in an angry state of mind, and when he heard this, his indignation grew more violent. He ordered Mariamne's eunuch, the one most faithful to her, to be brought and tortured about the potion, because he knew well that nothing small or great could be done without that man. Under the greatest agonies, the eunuch could say nothing about the matter for which he was being tortured. But he did say this much, that Mariamne's hatred of Herod had been caused by something Sohemus had told her. When Herod heard this, he cried out loudly that Sohemus, who at all other times had been most faithful to him and to his government, would never have betrayed the orders given to him unless he had been more intimate than ordinary with Mariamne. He therefore ordered Sohemus to be seized and killed immediately. Herod allowed his wife to stand trial. He gathered together those who were most faithful to him and brought a carefully framed accusation against her concerning the love potion and the mixture, though this charge had been laid against her only by slander. Yet he showed no moderation in what he said, and was in too much passion to judge the matter properly. At last, when the court saw that he was resolved, they passed a sentence of death on her. After the sentence had been given, however, Herod himself and some others of the court suggested a more restrained course, that she should not be put to death so hastily, but should instead be imprisoned in one of the fortresses of the kingdom. Salome and her party, however, worked hard to have the woman executed. They prevailed on the king to do it, advising him that this was the cautious course, because the people might riot if Mariamne were allowed to live. And so Mariamne was led away to execution. When Alexandra saw how matters were going, and realized there was little hope that she herself would escape the same treatment from Herod, she changed her behavior into the complete opposite of what might have been expected from her former boldness, and did so in a very shameful way. Wanting to show that she knew nothing at all of the crimes charged against Mariamne, she jumped up from her place and reproached her daughter in the hearing of everyone. "You have been a wicked woman and ungrateful to your husband. Your punishment has justly fallen on you for such insolent conduct, because you did not properly repay the man who has been the benefactor of us both." After Alexandra had carried on this hypocritical performance for some time, even going so far in her outrage as to tear her hair, the spectators condemned her indecent and false behavior, as was only to be expected. The poor woman who was about to suffer condemned it most of all. At first Mariamne said nothing to her, and was not shaken by her bitter temper. She only looked at her. Yet with great nobility of spirit, she showed that she was troubled by her mother's offense, especially by the way Alexandra exposed herself in such an unbecoming manner. As for Mariamne herself, she went to her death with a firm and unshaken mind. The color of her face did not change, and in the last moments of her life, she clearly showed the spectators the nobility of her birth. So died Mariamne, a woman of excellent character, both in chastity and in greatness of soul. Yet she lacked moderation and had too much of a contentious nature. She possessed every bodily beauty that can be spoken of, and a majestic presence in conversation. From this arose most of the reasons why she was not as agreeable to the king, or as happy in life with him, as she otherwise might have been. Because the king treated her with the greatest indulgence out of his deep fondness for her, and because she did not expect that he could ever do anything harsh to her, she allowed herself too much liberty. What troubled her most was what he had done to her relatives. She dared to speak openly of everything they had suffered at his hands, and in the end she greatly provoked both the king's mother and his sister, until they became her enemies. Even Herod himself, on whom alone she depended for any hope of escaping the final punishment, became her enemy too. But once she was dead, the king's affection for her burned more violently than before. We have already described his former passion for her. His love was not calm, nor like the ordinary affection found among husbands. From the beginning it had been almost frantic, and long cohabitation and free familiarity with her had never brought it under his control. At this time his love for Mariamne seemed to seize him in a strange way, as though it were divine vengeance on him for taking her life. He would often call for her and often lament for her in a most improper manner. He thought of everything he could use to distract his mind from her, and arranged feasts and gatherings for that purpose, but nothing was enough. He therefore set aside the administration of public affairs, and was so overcome by his passion that he ordered his servants to call for Mariamne, as though she were still alive and could still hear them. While he was in this condition, a pestilential disease broke out and carried off the greater part of the people, including his best and most valued friends. This made everyone suspect that the plague had come upon them from the anger of God because of the injustice done to Mariamne. This circumstance affected the king still more. At last he forced himself to go into desert places, pretending that he was going hunting, and there he bitterly tormented himself. But he had not endured his grief there for many days before he himself fell into a very dangerous sickness. He suffered from inflammation and from pain in the back of his head, together with madness. The remedies used on him did him no good at all, but instead proved harmful to his condition, and finally brought him to despair. All the physicians attending him, partly because the medicines they brought could not overcome the disease at all, and partly because his diet could be no other than what the disease inclined him to eat, told him to eat whatever he wanted. In this way they left the small hope they had for his recovery in the power of that diet, and committed him to fortune. His illness continued in this way while he was at Samaria, which is now called Sebast. At this time Alexandra was staying at Jerusalem. When she was informed of Herod's condition, she tried to get possession of the fortified places around the city. There were two of them, one belonging to the city itself, and the other belonging to the temple. Whoever held these places had the whole nation under his power, because without control of them it was not possible to offer the sacrifices. To every Jew, the thought of giving up those sacrifices is plainly impossible, for they are more ready to lose their lives than to give up the divine worship they have always paid to God. Alexandra therefore spoke with the men who guarded these strongholds. She told them that it was proper for them to hand the places over to her, and to Herod's sons, so that if he died no one else would seize the government, and so that if he recovered, no one could keep them more safely for him than members of his own family. They did not receive these words kindly. As they had been faithful to Herod in former times, they now resolved to remain even more faithful than ever, both because they hated Alexandra, and because they thought it a kind of impiety to despair of Herod's recovery while he was still alive. They had been his old friends, and one of them, named Josephus, was his cousin german. They therefore sent messengers to tell him of Alexandra's plan. Herod delayed no longer, but gave orders that she should be killed. Even so, it was only with difficulty, and after he had endured great pain, that he recovered from his illness. He was still grievously afflicted in both mind and body, was very uneasy, and was more ready than ever on every occasion to punish those who fell into his hands. He also killed the closest of his friends, Costobarus, Lysimachus, Critias, who was also called Antipater, and Josephus. This happened for the following reason. Costobarus was an Idumean by birth and one of the chief men among them. His ancestors had been priests of the Kos, whom the Idumeans had formerly regarded as a god. But after Hyrcanus changed their political government and made them receive the Jewish customs and law, Herod made Costobarus governor of Idumea and Gaza, and gave him his sister Salome as wife. This happened after the slaughter of his uncle Joseph, who had held that government before, as we have already related. When Costobarus rose to such high advancement, it pleased him more than he had hoped, and his good fortune made him more and more arrogant. In a short time he went beyond all bounds. He did not think it right to obey what Herod commanded as ruler, nor did he think the Idumeans should follow Jewish customs or be subject to them. He therefore sent to Cleopatra and informed her that the Idumeans had always been under his ancestors, and that for the same reason it was only just that she should ask Antony to give the country to him. He added that he was ready to transfer his friendship to her. He did this not because he would rather be under Cleopatra's government, but because he thought that if Herod's power were reduced, it would not be difficult for him to obtain the entire government over the Idumeans for himself, and something more besides. He raised his hopes still higher, because he had considerable claims, both from his birth and from the wealth he had gained through constant devotion to filthy profit. Accordingly, the object he aimed at was not small. Cleopatra asked Antony for this country, but failed in her purpose. Herod was told of the matter and was ready to kill Costobarus. Yet, at the entreaties of his sister and mother, he forgave him and granted him a full pardon, although from then on he remained suspicious of him because of this attempt. Some time later, when Salome quarreled with Costobarus, she sent him a bill of divorce and dissolved her marriage with him, though this was not according to the Jewish laws. Among us it is lawful for a husband to do this, but if a wife leaves her husband, she cannot marry another man by her own act unless her former husband puts her away. Salome, however, chose to follow not the law of her country but the law of her own authority, and so renounced her marriage. She told her brother Herod that she had left her husband out of goodwill toward him, because she had discovered that Costobarus, with Antipater, Lysimachus, and Dositheus, was raising a sedition against him. As evidence, she cited the case of the sons of Babus, saying that Costobarus had kept them alive for 12 years. This proved to be true. When Herod heard it so unexpectedly, he was greatly surprised, and still more surprised because the report seemed incredible to him. As for the sons of Babus, Herod had formerly taken great pains to have them punished as enemies of his government, but because so much time had passed since he had ordered them killed, he had now forgotten them. The cause of his hostility and hatred toward them was this: while Antigonus was king, Herod and his army besieged the city of Jerusalem. The distress and suffering of the besieged became so severe that most of them invited Herod into the city, and had already placed their hopes in him. The sons of Babus were men of great dignity and influence among the multitude. They were loyal to Antigonus, were always spreading accusations against Herod, and encouraged the people to preserve the government for the royal family that held it by inheritance. These men acted in this political way and, as they thought, for their own advantage. But when the city was taken and Herod had gained the government, Costobarus was appointed to stop people from passing out through the gates and to guard the city, so that citizens who were guilty and belonged to the party opposed to the king might not escape. Costobarus knew that the sons of Babus were respected and honored by the whole multitude, and he supposed their preservation might greatly benefit him in later changes of government. So he set them apart and hid them on his own farms. When the matter was suspected, he swore to Herod that he truly knew nothing about it, and so overcame the suspicions against him. Later, when the king publicly offered a reward for discovering them and used every method to search the matter out, Costobarus still would not confess. Having denied it at first, he became convinced that if the men were found, he would not escape punishment. He was therefore forced to keep them hidden, not only out of goodwill toward them, but also out of necessary concern for his own safety. But when the king learned the truth from his sister's information, he sent men to the places where he had been told they were concealed, and ordered both them, and those accused as guilty with them, to be killed. In this way none of the kindred of Hyrcanus remained at all. The kingdom was entirely in Herod's own power, and no one of such dignity was left who could put a stop to what he did against the Jewish laws. For this reason Herod departed from the laws of his country and damaged its ancient constitution by bringing in foreign customs, though that constitution ought to have been kept untouched. Because of this, we later became guilty of great wickedness, since the religious practices that had formerly guided the people toward piety were neglected. First, he appointed solemn games to be held every 5th year in honor of Caesar. He built a theater at Jerusalem, and also a very large amphitheater in the plain. Both buildings were costly, but they were contrary to Jewish customs, for no such spectacles had been handed down to us as things proper for us to use or exhibit. Still, he celebrated these games every 5 years with the greatest ceremony and splendor. He also sent proclamations into the neighboring countries and gathered people from every nation. Wrestlers, and all the others who competed for prizes in such games, were invited from every land, drawn both by hope of the rewards offered there and by the glory of victory to be won there. So the most important men, those most famous in these exercises, were brought together, because very great prizes were proposed for victory. These prizes were not only for those who performed athletic contests naked, but also for the musicians, who were called thymlesi. He spared no effort to persuade everyone most famous in such performances to come and compete. He also offered large rewards to those who raced for prizes in chariots drawn by 2, 3, or 4 pairs of horses. In his ambition to give the clearest public proof of his greatness, he copied everything from other nations, however costly or magnificent it was. Around the theater itself, he placed inscriptions of Caesar's great deeds and trophies of the nations Caesar had conquered in war, all made of the purest gold and silver. Nothing that could serve his design was left out, whether costly garments or precious stones arranged for display. All of it was exhibited at these games. He also made great preparations of wild animals, including many lions, and other beasts that were either unusually strong or of kinds rarely seen. These were set either to fight one another, or to fight men who had been condemned to death. Foreigners were greatly amazed and delighted by the immense expense displayed there and by the great dangers they saw. But to native Jews this seemed nothing less than the destruction of the customs they revered so deeply. It also seemed plain impiety to throw men to wild beasts merely to entertain the spectators, and no less impious to exchange their own laws for such foreign contests. Above all, the trophies offended the Jews most. They imagined that human images were enclosed inside the armor hung around them, and they were deeply displeased, because it was not the custom of their country to honor such images. Herod was not unaware of the disturbance among them. Since he thought it was not the right time to use force, he spoke comfortingly to some of them, and tried to free them from the superstitious fear they were under. But he could not satisfy them. In their great distress over the offenses they believed he had committed, they cried out together that although they might consider bearing everything else, they would never tolerate images of men in their city. By this they meant the trophies, because such things were contrary to their country's laws. When Herod saw them in such disorder, and saw that they would not easily change their minds unless they were satisfied on this point, he called the most prominent men among them to him, brought them into the theater, showed them the trophies, and asked what kind of things they thought these trophies were. When they cried out that they were images of men, he ordered the ornaments around them to be stripped off, and showed them the bare pieces of wood underneath. Once the wood had no ornament on it, it became a subject of great amusement and laughter to them, because they had always mocked the ornaments of the images themselves. After Herod had thus cleared himself before the crowd, and had calmed the force of their anger, most of the people were ready to change their behavior and no longer remain displeased with him. Yet some still continued angry at him for introducing new customs. They believed that violating the laws of their country was likely to become the beginning of very great disasters for them. They therefore thought it an act of piety to risk being put to death rather than appear to ignore what Herod had done. For after changing their form of government, he had violently introduced customs they had never known before. In appearance he was a king, but in reality he showed himself an enemy of their whole nation. For this reason 10 men who were citizens of Jerusalem formed a conspiracy against him. They swore to one another that they would face any danger in the attempt, and they carried daggers under their garments in order to kill Herod. Among these sworn conspirators there was also a certain blind man, moved by indignation at what he had heard had been done. He could not give the others any real help in the undertaking, but he was ready to suffer with them if they came to harm. In this way he became a very strong encouragement to the rest of those undertaking the plot. When they had reached this decision by common agreement, they went into the theater. They hoped first that Herod himself would not be able to escape them, since they would attack him so unexpectedly. But even if they missed him, they supposed they would kill many of those around him. They chose this course even though they expected to die for it, in order to make the king understand what injuries he had done to the people. So these conspirators, having prepared themselves beforehand, went about their design with great eagerness. But one of Herod's spies, who had been appointed for such purposes, to discover conspiracies against him and report them, found out the whole affair. He told the king of it just as Herod was about to enter the theater. When Herod considered the hatred that he knew most of the people bore him, and the disturbances that arose on every occasion, he thought this plot against him was quite believable. He therefore withdrew into his palace and called before him by name those who were accused of the conspiracy. The guards fell upon them and caught them in the very act. Knowing they could not escape, they prepared themselves for death as honorably as they could, and did not give up their determined bearing at all. They showed no shame for what they had intended, and did not deny it. When they were seized, they displayed their daggers and declared that the conspiracy they had sworn to carry out was a holy and pious action. What they meant to do was not for gain, nor to satisfy any private passion, but chiefly for the common customs of their country, which all Jews were bound either to observe or to die for. This is what these men said with fearless courage in their conspiracy. They were then led away to execution by the king's guards who stood around them, and they patiently endured all the torments inflicted on them until they died. It was not long before the spy who had exposed them was seized by some of the people because of their hatred for him. They not only killed him, but tore him limb from limb and gave his body to the dogs. Many citizens saw this execution, yet not one of them would identify those who had done it. At last, when Herod made a strict inquiry and used bitter and severe tortures, certain women who were tortured confessed what they had seen. The men responsible for the deed were punished so terribly by the king that their entire families were destroyed because of this rash attempt. Even so, the stubbornness of the people and the fearless constancy they showed in defense of their laws did not make Herod gentler toward them. Instead, he strengthened his own position in a more secure way and resolved to surround the multitude on every side, so that such innovations would not end in open rebellion. Since he had now fortified the city by means of the palace in which he lived, and by the temple, which had beside it a strong fortress called Antonia, rebuilt by him, Herod planned also to make Samaria a fortress for himself against the whole people. He called it Sebast, supposing that this place would be a stronghold against the country, not inferior to the others. So he fortified that place, which was a day's journey from Jerusalem, and which would be useful to him generally for keeping both the country and the city in awe. He also built another fortress for the whole nation. It had formerly been called Strato's Tower, but he named it Caesarea. In addition, he chose out select horsemen and stationed them in the Great Plain. For them he built a place in Galilee called Gaba, and also Hesebonitis and Perea. These were the places he especially built, while he was always inventing some further measure for his own security and surrounding the whole nation with guards. His purpose was that they should by no means escape his power or fall into tumults, as they were continually inclined to do at even a slight disturbance. If they did make any commotion, he wanted to know of it at once, because his spies would be near them, and would be able both to discover what they were attempting and to prevent it. When he set about building the wall of Samaria, he arranged to bring there many of those who had assisted him in his wars, along with many people from the surrounding region, and he made them fellow citizens with the others. He did this partly from an ambitious desire to build a temple, and partly from a desire to make the city more distinguished than it had been before. But his chief purpose was that it should serve both as a protection for himself and as a monument of his magnificence. He also changed its name and called it Sebast. Moreover, he divided the adjoining country, which was excellent land of its kind, among the inhabitants of Samaria, so that they might be prosperous from the time they first came to live there. Besides all this, he surrounded the city with a very strong wall, and used the slope of the place to make its fortifications stronger. The city's circuit was no longer as small as it had been before, but was made large enough that it was not inferior to the most famous cities, for it was 20 furlongs around. Inside the city, near its middle, he built a sacred precinct measuring 1.5 furlongs in circuit. He adorned it with every kind of decoration, and in it he erected a temple remarkable both for its size and its beauty. He also decorated the various parts of the city with ornaments of every sort. As for what was necessary for his own security, he made the walls very strong for that purpose, and made the place mostly a citadel. And as for the elegance of the building, he also took care of that, so that he might leave to future ages monuments of the refinement of his taste and of his generosity.
And there we will pause, in the wreckage of Herod's own household, his queen dead by his order, her mother dead, the last Hasmonean partisans dead, and Herod himself hollowed out by a grief no victory could touch. He has secured his throne against every rival by the simple method of killing them, and discovered that it has not made him happy. Next time, in part 4, the close of the book, and the turn from destruction to building. A terrible famine grips the whole region, and we meet the other Herod, the king who melts down the gold of his own palace to buy Egyptian grain, and feed his starving people. And then the great works begin, the new cities, and, above them all, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly. One last thing before you go. There is a part on our stage still wanting a voice, and it may as well be yours. Come and read for us at footnotesandfolly.click, and be in the next telling rather than only watching it. And before the lamp goes out, a small request. If something tonight taught you, or surprised you, or simply delighted you, do leave a comment and tell me what it was. And if there is a work, an author, or a tale you should like me to take up next, set it down there as well. I read every one, and many an episode has begun its life as a viewer's suggestion. Until next time.